All right. So, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar sharing key aspects of Trees version 3.0, which was recently released by the Architecture for Red Plus Transactions, or ART. My name is Michaela Weiss. I'm Associate Director for Stakeholder Engagement with ART, and I'm excited to walk you through the review process and the major changes in Trees 3.0. So before we begin, just a few logistics about the webinar today. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A box located at the bottom of the webinar screen, and we'll address questions at the end of the presentation. And this webinar is also being recorded and will be made available along with the slides on the ART website. So for those that might not be as familiar with ART, I'd like to start just with a brief background. So ART is a global carbon crediting program designed to issue high quality jurisdictional RED Plus credits. ART is governed and managed by an independent board of directors and the ART Secretariat. We aim to attract finance at scale while ensuring environmental and social integrity by certifying results that can be monetized in the voluntary or compliance carbon markets or be used as the basis for results-based payments. Our vision is simple but ambitious: to build the confidence needed in the integrity of forest emission reductions and removals so that large-scale investments can flow into efforts to protect and restore forests and reward those who deliver those results. ART's requirements are all laid out in our standard, the RED Plus Environmental Excellence Standard, or TREES. TREES specifies the requirements that jurisdictions must follow in order to be issued credits, including requirements around eligibility, carbon accounting, safeguards, double counting, and much more. TREES also stipulates that ART must review the standard at a minimum of every 3 years in order to account for changing best practices, emerging science and technologies, and experience in implementing the standard. TREES 3.0 is a result of the most recent regularly scheduled review. TREES 3.0 also reflects 4 years of experience implementing the standard across now 27 participating jurisdictions. So nearly 25% of the world's tropical forests are already represented in jurisdictional RED Plus programs listed on the ART registry, which is an area covering more than 400 million hectares. The trees review process provided us an opportunity to refine the standard based on the experiences of the ART team, participating jurisdictions, and the many, many other involved stakeholders. Our goal was to ensure that trees continues to represent best practice and high integrity while also incorporating lessons learned to improve the ease of use and streamline reporting. So our process to review trees was as follows. First, we engaged in targeted dialogues with stakeholders to better understand their experiences and perspectives on the standard. And then we used those inputs to work with the ART board to identify elements of trees to update. Last July, we published a board-approved draft for public comment and have since worked with the ART board to modify the draft based on the comments received before publishing the final version last month. So throughout the process, the Secretariat was fortunate to have support in developing TREES 3.0 from the IPLC Advisory Group, which is made up of members Anekap, Koyabi, Redmokaf, and Repaliak, along with 2 leaders acting in a personal capacity. The IPLC Advisory Group assisted in designing the IPLC regional dialogues, which I'll discuss in just a minute. They reviewed inputs and comments from other stakeholders, provided reflections, insights, and ideas, and reviewed drafts of the standard. The advisory group is continuing to work with ART to develop guidance materials and other tools that are currently in development. Before we began drafting TREES 3.0, we also engaged with a number of stakeholders through targeted dialogues. We held 3 in-person multi-day dialogues directly with Indigenous peoples and local communities in 3 different regions. We also convened 2 expert committees to discuss the potential inclusion of removals from forest remaining forests and biomass flux data into trees. We met with 29 governments, NGOs, civil society organizations, and technical service providers to better understand their experiences using trees, and we received written inputs from a number of stakeholders. And using all of that input, along with the Secretariat's own experiences, we worked with the art board to put together the draft for public comment. Many of the proposed changes focused on clarifying requirements and streamlining reporting. During the public comment period, we received more than 30 official submissions, totaling nearly 700 individual comments. You can find all of the submissions along with our response to each comment on the ART website. We held 13 art board meetings in order to review all of those comments and make decisions around the standard. The art board also documented their rationale for the most substantive decisions in the Statement of Reasons document, which you can find on our website. So we released the final version of Trees 3.0 on June 25th. The official version of Trees is in English, but we are also excited to share the text in French, Spanish, and Portuguese to make it more accessible to all users. All of the documents on the process are also available on the ART website, including the public comment version of Trees 3.0, all of the public comments and our responses, a summary of the changes from Trees 2.0, and the statement of reasons that I mentioned previously. We're working now to finalize templates for participant documents and other tools, and we will be updating the trees validation and verification standard along with templates for validation and verification bodies shortly. So existing participants that have an accepted trees registration document, even if it hasn't yet been published on the art registry, may complete their current crediting period using trees 2.0. After that, they will need to transition to trees 3.0. All other participants will need to use trees 3.0. If a participant has already submitted a trees concept and had it accepted, they will not need to resubmit the trees concept in order to use trees 3.0. All right, so now let's dive into the details of what has changed. I'm going to focus this presentation on the most significant changes from Trees 2.0, so I am assuming some understanding of the core elements of Trees. Just as a reminder, you can find the full summary of changes and the complete text of Trees 3.0 on the ART website. So let's start from the beginning with Section 2 on the ART cycle. Trees 3.0 requires that the trees concept, trees registration document, and trees monitoring report be submitted in English, which is the version used for validation and verification. But the documents must also be submitted in any other language or languages used for the participants' government operations in the accounting area. This is in order to ensure greater accessibility of those documents. Trees 3.0 also requires submission of the trees registration document within 2 calendar years of the acceptance of the trees concept. Participants that miss this deadline will need to submit a new trees concept. Trees 3.0 also lengthens the time frame for an initial validation and verification from 12 months to 18 months to provide more realistic expectations. The time frame for subsequent validation and verifications remains at 12 months. And finally, Trees 3.0 lengthens the mandatory public comment period for participant documents from 30 days to 60 days and explicitly requires that participants notify stakeholders in line with their safeguards processes in order to make the public comment period more inclusive and accessible. And while this extends the required public comment period, ART will continue its practice of accepting comments as long as they can be incorporated into the validation and verification process. Trees 3.0 also features several changes on eligibility. So in section 3.1.1 on subnational accounting, the time frame where subnational accounting is permitted has been extended from the end of 2030 to the end of 2035. After 2035, participants must be national governments and they must report national emissions annually, although crediting can be either national or subnational. The requirements for reporting national emissions and aligning national accounting with subnational crediting will be part of the next version of TREES. TREES 3.0 also has new requirements for national reporting under the UNFCCC. So participants were already required to have a safeguard information system in place under TREES 2.0, and several other elements of RED Plus reporting under the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement were implied. In 3.0, it is explicit that national government participants must demonstrate conformance with all UNFCCC RED Plus elements. So in addition to the Safeguard Information System, this includes a RED Plus national strategy or action plan, an assessed forest reference emission level or forest reference level or FREL, a national forest monitoring system, and reported RED Plus results for the crediting years. Participants are able to proceed with trees processes, including issuance, while they work towards demonstrating conformance with all of these elements, since we realize that the reporting cycles do not always fully align. One of the more exciting changes in Trees 3.0 is the introduction of a time-bound transition pathway for certain participants to join ART with unique eligibility criteria. So participants in the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, or FCPF, Carbon Fund Program, or the Initiative for Sustainable Forest Landscapes, ISFL, can use their FCPF or ISFL accounting area for one crediting period, even if it does not meet the tree's eligibility requirements. After that, they can use the pathway for other eligible participants for a second crediting period or meet the tree's eligibility criteria. Other eligible participants may use a subnational accounting area that has 1.25, at least 1.25 million hectares of forest, rather than the 2.5 million hectares generally required in trees, for up to 2 crediting periods. Eligible participants include those that are small island developing states, countries with less than 2.5 million hectares of forest to begin with, countries that previously participated in another RED Plus or readiness program, and submissions comprised exclusively of Indigenous territories. In order to use this transition pathway, participants must have their trees concept accepted by the end of 2028, and the pathway can only be used until the end of 2035. Credits that are issued from accounting areas using this pathway that do not meet the regular trees criteria will be labeled as transition pathway in the ART registry. And finally, it's important to emphasize that this transition pathway only affects the accounting area boundaries that are used. All other requirements of trees for carbon accounting, safeguards, and all other aspects must still be met. Trees 3.0 also includes a new section on rights to emission reductions and removals and on benefit sharing arrangements. Both of these topics were included in Trees 2.0, but Trees 3.0 provides greater clarity on the requirements. The new sections explicitly require participants to describe their benefit sharing arrangements and provide specific requirements on what information must be shared regarding the arrangements and their development, including how they conform with relevant safeguards. The new sections also clarify the timeline and documentation needed around demonstrating rights to emission reductions and removals and on benefit sharing arrangements. New to Trees 3.0 are requirements to ensure that baselines are set below business as usual in order to address requirements from CORSIA and from the market in general. So for the trees crediting approach, which is based on the 5-year historical average of emissions from deforestation and degradation, participants must ensure that the crediting level is below business as usual, either by taking a 1% deduction to the crediting level or by demonstrating that the crediting level is conservative compared to the jurisdiction-specific threat of emissions. The HFLD crediting approach also includes new requirements related to below business as usual baselines. Participants using the HFLD crediting approach must describe the RED Plus activities they implemented during the reference period or the 5 years preceding the crediting period. They must also provide quantitative evidence that the HFLD crediting level is conservative compared to the threat of emissions. TREES 3.0 also removes the option for participants using the HFLD crediting approach to claim avoided foregone removals, an option that required significant additional work and was not being adopted by jurisdictions under TREES 2.0. Trees 3.0 also contains several changes related to removals. These changes were largely made to provide more clarity on the requirements of the approach included in Trees 2.0 and to offer an alternative approach for participants that better aligns with the data that many countries have on removals. So the first major change is the eligibility to claim removals. Under Trees 2.0, removals could only be claimed if participants had a decrease in emissions during that same year. In Trees 3.0, participants can claim removals if they have a decrease in emissions for that year, or jurisdictions with a deforestation rate of less than 0.25% in each year of the reference period may claim removals if the removals are greater than any increase in emissions in that year, and the emissions are no more than 15% above the tree's crediting level. This change acknowledges the fact that jurisdictions with sustained low emissions may be unable to continually decrease their emissions. Trees 3.0 also introduces a new option for removals crediting. Under Trees 3.0, participants may credit for removals using the spatially explicit approach, which is the same as in Trees 2.0, or they may use the sample-based approach, which is a new approach that is more similar to what is typically used for emissions accounting. The two approaches have different activity data requirements, and as you'll see in the coming slides, different crediting levels. The spatially explicit approach requires individual polygons of removals areas, each with a documented link to the participant's REDD+ activities and a demonstration that the area was non-forest for at least 5 years prior to restoration. As appropriate, given the high level of documentation required to demonstrate additionality, participants using this approach will be eligible for a zero baseline for natural forest restoration. 1% of the removals results will be deducted from the total to ensure that crediting is above business as usual. For commercial forest restoration, participants will use a 5-year historical average as the crediting level, and to ensure that the crediting level is set above business as usual, participants either need to increase the crediting level by 1% or demonstrate that the 5-year historical average is higher than would occur without the REDD+ activities. The sample-based approach, on the other hand, can only be used for natural forest restoration, and it is based on area estimates rather than spatial data. Participants must demonstrate REDD+ activities related to removals, but they don't need to show causality between individual areas of removals and the REDD+ activities. Under the sample-based approach, participants will use a 5-year historical average as the crediting level. And as before, participants either need to increase the crediting level by 1% or demonstrate that it's higher than would occur without REDD+ activities in order to demonstrate that the crediting level is above business as usual. So now for Section 5 on carbon accounting, Trees 3.0 includes several clarifications and more explicit requirements. Trees 3.0 clarifies requirements for emissions activity data, and it separates and clarifies the requirements for removals activity data following the two approaches that I just described. Trees 3.0 also has more explicit requirements for justifying stratification and for the selection of appropriate emission and removal factors. It also has changes to allow additional flexibility for accounting for peat emissions, allowing participants to request variances to the crediting level to account for accumulating emissions from peat decomposition, and allowing participants with low emissions from peat to use Tier 1 methods and assume that emissions are instantaneous. In Section 7, Trees 3.0 introduces a new trees reversal risk rating tool to assess reversal risk and the associated contribution of credits to the buffer pool. This new tool incorporates the elements of the assessment under Trees 2.0, but also includes additional elements to better reflect specific jurisdictional risks and to permit a wider variety of outcomes. The risk rating tool uses a starting value of 5%, which is added to based on jurisdictional specific risk, up to a maximum of 25% or 30% in the event of a prior reversal. The risk rating tool requires participants to evaluate indicators that assess their governance risk, program continuity risk, and vulnerability to disturbances risk. And similar to Trees 2.0, the risk rating tool must be applied and verified for each year of the crediting period to ensure that changes in risk associated with any changes to the program or its governance are identified and immediately incorporated. In Section 10, on calculation of emission reductions and removals, Trees 3.0 has several changes to streamline and clarify the equations. First, Trees 3.0 simplifies and improves the clarity of the removals equations, including separating equations for the two removals approaches. Second, Trees 3.0 separates all equations for emission reductions and removals, which are reported separately on the ART registry. This change eliminates the confusion of having a single set of equations in trees, while the subtotals are verified separately for labeling in the registry. Third, Trees 3.0 includes deductions for emissions reductions and removals from other initiatives, or for which the participant does not have the rights explicitly in the equations. These were already required to be deducted from Trees credit volumes under 2.0, but they were not included in the equations in Section 10. And fourth, Trees 3.0 applies the buffer pool contribution after all other deductions have already been made. This ensures that any reversal compensation from the buffer pool is done with credits that represent actual results for which the participant has the rights. For safeguards, in Trees 3.0, the safeguards continue to follow the foundation started in Trees 2.0, building on the 7 Cancun safeguards as agreed by the Conference of Parties of the UNFCCC and unpacking them into 16 themes. Each of the themes now has a single structure and process indicator that combines the individual structure and process indicators that we had in Trees 2.0, and each theme continues to have an outcome indicator. So by reducing repetition and consolidating related information, it will be easier for participants to document their programs and results. It will also make the documents easier to navigate for stakeholders, enabling them to find information more easily, to better understand how the Red Plus program is designed and implemented, and provide meaningful feedback if they desire during the public comment period. Trees 3.0 also clarifies the timeline and form of reporting for the outcome indicators. In the trees registration document, participants must show that relevant past RED Plus activities, such as consultations or agreements, were implemented in line with the safeguard requirements, and define the expected results of activities that will be carried out during the crediting period. In the trees monitoring reports, participants will need to report on whether the expected results were achieved and describe any new or modified activities to conform with the safeguards. There are also several important changes to certain safeguard themes under Trees 3.0. So first, in the requirement regarding dispute resolution mechanisms under theme 2.4, participants are required to proactively communicate how any disputes will be handled and to track their outcomes. Second, Trees 3.0 moves the requirements on free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC, from theme 4.2, on participation to theme 3.3, which is about respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant peoples. That is in recognition of the fact that participation can be much broader than just asking for consent. Furthermore, theme 4.2 was reframed to require participants to guarantee that the participation of Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant peoples occurs through their respective decision-making structures and processes, ensuring adequate conditions for their participation and using culturally appropriate procedures. This helps to have a clear distinction between this theme and theme 4.1, which is around the full and effective participation of all relevant stakeholders. And fourth, Trees 3.0 clarifies which themes relate to the distribution of benefits to address a common question from Trees 2.0 and to make it explicit that participants must report on how they respected the Cancun safeguards throughout the design and implementation of their benefit sharing arrangements. Trees 3.0 also included a number of changes regarding inclusion. So, women, youth, and vulnerable groups are now explicitly mentioned in the themes related to full and effective participation and the enhancement of social benefits. While these groups were always implicitly included in the tree's safeguards, this is now explicit in the standard. Second, Afro-descendant peoples, transhumant communities, and indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact are now referred to in the relevant safeguards. And finally, many important changes to the text to improve the clarity were also incorporated in order to respond to the public comments. In section 13 on avoiding double counting, first, Trees 3.0 clarifies the requirements for deducting verified emission reductions and removals from other CO2 equivalent based initiatives, including carbon credit projects or results based payments from the Trees credit volume. Second, Trees 3.0 specifies that variances may be submitted for these requirements to address a question that ART has commonly received. And third, Trees 3.0 clarifies the requirements for corresponding adjustments, including the latest guidance from the UNFCCC. These are also further clarified in Annex A on requirements for avoiding double counting with ICAO's CORSIA. Trees 3.0 also includes a revised Section 16 on the complaints and appeals process based on our experience and stakeholder input. Trees 3.0 clarifies that the complaints and appeals process in Trees is meant to handle instances where ART has not followed its practices and outlines how other types of complaints can best be addressed. For example, through the appropriate dispute resolution mechanism of the participants' Red Plus program or as part of the validation and verification process. Trees 3.0 also changes the complaints and appeals approach to create a list of potential reviewers and investigators that are not part of ART or of WinRock. If a complaint is submitted, an appropriate individual will be selected from that list based on the nature of the complaints and availability. Trees 3.0 also provides revised eligibility criteria and a submission process for a complaint or appeal. These changes were based on stakeholder inputs as well as a review of similar programs processes. And finally, Trees 3.0 updates the steps and timelines for the review process. So that concludes the summary of the most substantial changes in Trees 3.0. I encourage you to read the full summary of changes and the Trees 3.0 document, since I was only able to briefly touch on these topics today. Again, you can find Trees 3.0 in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French, as well as all of our supporting documentation on our website at www.artred.org. So we'll now start responding to questions that we received in the Q&A box, but please also feel free to email us at any time with questions at red@winrock.org. So thank you so much for your attention.